main thing. Okay. So this is Feminist Perspectives in the Tanakh. Thank you for joining us for our first class. Just by way of introduction, that all of our sessions are going to be geared towards feminist perspectives in the Tanakh, but they're going to be different takes and different stories and different characters. So each session can stand alone. So if you miss one, you don't have to worry about continuity. If anyone missed tonight's, they can still attend the other ones without missing out on anything. So tonight's theme is names and values. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But in the meantime, I wanted to start with some icebreakers. And so feel free to unmute for this if you want to take a second to think about it. But who is your favorite character in the Tanakh and why? Does anyone want to get the ball rolling? Favorite character in the Tanakh?
Do you mean it has to be a woman?
Any character in the Tanakh. Who's your favorite character in the Tanakh?
Right now, I'm going to say Jonah because you said names and my name means Jonah.
All right. Anybody else? Favorite character? Yeah.
I'm going to say Esther.
Okay. Esther.
Because I used her in our bat mitzvah sermon.
Okay. Cool.
I'm saying Ruth.
Very nice. That's very fitting.
How about Leah? Is Leah there?
Leah's a good one. All right.
That's I chose Leah because I'm Leah.
Very nice.
I'm playing it safe and saying God.
God. Character.
Yeah.
God is definitely a character in the Tanakh. That's you don't hear that. You actually don't hear that answer very often. That's a nice one.
It's the one
Anyone
I was
else?
thinking of, but I wasn't sure whether to call God a character exactly.
God plays a role in the story of the Tanakh. So I would say yes. God qualifies for sure. Susan, were you about to share one?
So the prime actor.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Cantor, are you going to tell us
admired-
yours?
I will. Susan, go ahead.
admired The daughters of Zelophehad.
We're going to talk about that today. We are going to talk about that because about
Very
names
good.
and that, like absolutely. So we'll talk about
And
that.
yes,
I think.
they're each named. Yes, that's true.
Yes, we will go through that. Yes, very nice. I'm glad that someone else knows about that. Anyone else want to share? Favorite character, any character in the Tanakh. There are so many to choose from.
Tyble said, "Are you going to mention yours? Your favorite character?"
Yes, I know. I will.
Okay.
I honestly, my answer changes depending on my mood or the day or whatever. Oftentimes I would say Miriam. Certainly there's not a single character in the Tanakh that's perfect. And Miriam's not perfect either, but the fact she's very inspiring, that she leads the women in song and dance, and she certainly takes on a protective role over her baby brother Moses when he's floating on the river, and so she definitely, and depending on how you view the story, some sages say that Shifra and Pua are two women in those times who were helping, and they say that was actually Yocheved and Miriam who were helping the Hebrew women in the continue to bring children into the world under such adverse circumstances during slavery in Egypt. So so she's definitely a very interesting one, but I think Abraham's certainly a good one too. I mean, there are many characters to choose from. Another icebreaker question: how many women in the Tanakh can we name? So we've named a few already, but like if we want to, you can either in the chat. Actually, it's probably easier to unmute because I don't know if I can toggle between the chat and the slideshow. So if you want to unmute and name a couple, we'll just try to popcorn it. And yeah,
How about start with the Imahot, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah.
All right.
Laura.
I'm named after Eve, Chava.
Chava, we're going to talk about her.
Of course, there's the four that you just named: Miriam, Yocheved,
Shifra and Pua.
Shifra,
Yeah.
and Pua.
And by the way, the Imahot, by the way, and we'll talk about this a little bit at some point too, but we add the for those of us who add the Imahot when we pray the Amidah, it's we say Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, but Rachel and there was also Zilpah and Bilhah, right? So they also had, you know, and they were sort of not viewed as wives, but more as concubines, but they have names too. I guess if you name all of those, it can be quite a mouthful though. Any other? Yeah?
Devorah, because when you
Devorah.
think about the 7 female prophets, Devorah, Miriam, and then if you throw in King David's wives, you get, I mean,
Okay, how many can we name? We can't necessarily name all of them, all of his wives.
Abigail,
There's a few of them
and
that we can.
Michal.
Bathsheba, Michal, yep. Those are kind of the main ones that we name.
Hannah.
Hannah, yeah, Hannah, yeah.
Someone said before Zelophehad's daughters, so aren't there 7 of those?
5 of those,
Tirzah?
and yes.
Oh,
yes.
Tirzah,
We'll get to those names in a bit. Yes.
There's Laban's what was his name? Over there in Laban's family, there's the one that married his Abraham's brother, Milcah, is it?
Milcah, that's definitely a name, and then also that's a very popular name. It recurs a few times actually in the Tanakh. A few different women were named Milcah.
Ista, who has 1 mention.
Okay.
Dina, Batya.
Dina, Batya, yeah. Well, actually, Batya is not a woman that we can name in the Tanakh. We'll talk about that later too.
Tamar.
Tamar, yes.
Yael.
Yael, very
That's
nice.
a good one.
Yes.
Lot's wife, Mrs. Lot.
Well, we can't name her. We can't
Right.
name her. We're going to talk about that too. We're going to talk about that.
And the
Yeah,
daughters.
Naomi. Debbie said
Ruth and Naomi, that's true. Yes. All right, so those are quite a few names that we can come up with so far. So we're going to move on. So we're going to first, we can't start this off without talking about the first woman, Chava, Eve. So show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the fact that there's actually two distinct creation stories in the book of Genesis? Yes, most of us? Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break from the slideshow, and I'm going to, and hopefully you can still see this. Can you see the Sefaria sheet? The Sefaria article? No. Okay, here, I'm going to stop the share.
It's just a PowerPoint.
I'm gonna reshare now. Okay, so now you can see, we're gonna skip past the heap. We're gonna go here. So does anybody want to read the first creation story? Anyone want to volunteer to read it?
In English?
English, yeah, right here, English.
I can do English, okay.
Please, go ahead.
And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. And God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fertile and increase. Fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on earth. God said, see, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food. And to all the animals on land, to all the birds of the sky, and to everything that creeps on earth, in which there is breath of life, I give all the green plants for food. And it was so.
Very nice, thank you. So that's the first creation story. And I'd say the main sort of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Look, it says it does say every seed-bearing plant, every tree that has seed-bearing fruit shall be yours for food. So I think you can sort of those of us. I mean, I'm sure we know the story about the fruit and that was eaten. So I think we can sort of infer then that that's really more part of the second creation story. So let's get into that one. Would someone else like to read the English for this one, the second creation story? You can
I'll read it
if you would like to. Please.
And I do English too.
Yeah,
Lord
well,
God
English,
formed
yeah.
man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east and placed there the man whom he had formed. And from the ground, the Lord God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. A river issues from Eden to water the garden, and it then divides and becomes 4 branches.
We can actually sort of skip to 15 if you would.
Okay.
Here.
The Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat. But as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it. For as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. The Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him. Keep going.
Yeah.
And the Lord God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that would be its name. And the man gave names to all the cattle and the birds and the wild beasts. But for Adam, no fitting helper was found. So the Lord God cast a deep sleep upon the man. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at the spot. And the Lord God fashioned the rib that he had taken from the man into a woman, and he brought her to the man. Then the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man was she taken.
Okay, so we'll sort of stop there. I mean, I'm sure we're familiar with what happens next. I want to point out here, I'll get back to the PowerPoint. So here. Oh, there we go. So obviously the stories are different, very different views of things. First of all, if you look at the first creation story, it follows after, each day in the week, right? And 7th day God rested, right? So in that story, humankind was created last. But here in the second version of the story, that's not the case. Man is created first, not both humans at the same time, but just man. And then in the course of trying to find a fitting helper for man, God creates all the other animals, right? And then none of them work as being the correct sort of mate or helper, right, to Adam. So then Eve is created from Adam's side, from Adam's rib. And there are multiple interpretations of why we have these two different stories. Some say that it's different writers. Some people say that there's actually if mankind was created in God's image, and humankind is pretty diverse, right, and includes male and female, but it also says male and female created them, right? So maybe if you put the two stories together, Adam and Eve were created at the same time, but then had to be separated by the side, and then they could actually see each other and know that the other one existed. So, I mean, if anyone has heard that story, that's one of the interpretations from why we have those different stories. But I want to talk about the punishment for the sin of eating the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. We saw in that story, who was given the instruction to not eat from the tree? Who was given that instruction?
Adam,
just man, just Adam, right? Eve wasn't in the picture yet. Chava wasn't fashioned yet. Okay, so it was just Adam who was given that instruction. Later in that story, Adam does relate God's instruction to Eve, but he doesn't frame it the same way. So God had said, for on that day, surely you shall die. You don't eat the fruit, right? Adam took it a step further and he said, don't even touch it, right? Or you'll surely die. And that's where, when the serpent comes in, the serpent's able to fool Chava because he says, well, look, I'm touching this tree and I'm fine. So clearly, your instructions must be off, right? So that's sort of where, I mean, on the one hand, maybe Adam was trying to kind of create the fence around it, but that made it even more complicated, right? Because that's actually where the serpent was able to worm through. So Why do we have two creation stories? Does anyone want to sort of start thinking about this question? What are some possible answers for why do we have two? What's the value of both of them?
I don't know if you want raise hands or just jump
Please,
in.
just go ahead and unmute. Yeah, that's fine.
Because as Jews, we have to have lots to talk about every year. And number one is conservative Jews. These and those are the words of the living God. It's, well, then they're not oppositional to each other. Speaking of they there can I go, but they're not oppositional, but there's enough difference that it engages someone who's taking the text seriously more than if there were just one version.
Very true. Okay. Any other opinions on the two creation stories?
I think you could also say that the first one feels more general.
Yeah.
And the second one, sort of following up on what Tybal said, feels more specific or more detailed. So maybe they fit together in that sense. Or I suppose if we're going to take Professor Friedman's view, maybe it's just that one was written in the North and the other was written in the South. And when the North gets defeated and people refugee South, the stories get combined.
That certainly is one, and you might have noticed the language changed. Even in the translation with English, you could see the Lord God every time. So that, that's one of the explanations. Linguistically, they sort of, they're different voices, right? It doesn't, I mean, we don't know exactly why that is, but certainly that could be an explanation. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I've heard an interesting one in that, later on we get a lot of detail about the flood with Noah, and the early world was destroyed, and we had the world after Noah. But there's some discussion that possibly God was just trying things out early in the process, and these really are two different creation stories. What's missing between them is the destruction story or the let's start over story. But that that there could have been multiple, and people use that to an advantage. If you worry about dinosaurs and the like, well, we're counting from the wrong story or something of that sort.
That's a very interesting observation, because if you look at any society, and you look way back in the day, every society had some version of a creation story. This is, I guess, these together are like some of the most famous or popular ones. But there are so many different kinds. And it's actually a really interesting topic to delve into. If you read the different creation stories, some of them are pretty wildly different. I think when you have multiple gods in the story, it really sort of changes the way that's viewed. With one god, it's a little bit different. But yeah, that's the fact that there could be a destruction in between. Certainly, there were many cataclysmic events that occurred within the history of this planet, and whether humankind was witness to some of those or not, is a different story. But certainly it wouldn't be out of hand to think that. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I have one.
Yeah.
So what if Adam was actually they weren't humans as we know it, and they were souls, and so we have the feminine and the masculine soul, but then at this moment where there was a decision that where we took something earthly into our body, then we became this different dimension of human.
I like that. It's a nice interpretation. Yeah. Certainly, the idea of beshert, and the idea, the idea is that when it comes to marriage and to soulmates, the idea is that you share a soul. So that does sort of fit into that Jewish lens of relationships. The idea that maybe the soul was shared, and how that sort of oriented itself outward could have had an effect on the different stories. I like that. Anyone else? I will say that in terms of values and perspectives, from my personal view, the first creation story seems more like an explanation of how all these things came to be. And then I feel like the second creation story is more of like a parable that's like supposed to like teach you lessons of like, look, humankind made this mistake, and so now we lose paradise. And like there are certain levels to that, and the fact that woman is blamed for that is also, I think, a very interesting part of the story. The question then becomes, does Eve's treatment for the sin seem fair? The fact that she takes on the brunt of the blame for the fact that she and Adam sinned, right? That they transgressed against what God had instructed them to do. But like I said, again, she was not given that instruction. She was related that instruction secondhand by Adam. And if you read the rest of the story, the punishment is for both of them. They're both kicked out of Eden. But I mean, yeah, Adam they now have to work for their food and everything like that, right? But Eve is punished. It specifically says is punished with painful childbearing. It mentions in that part of the story as a consequence of her actions. So, I mean, which isn't to say that that's how it is, but that certainly is how the story lays it out. Does that seem like a fair treatment?
I heard that's actually, some consider that reduction of the original claim from God, who said, you will die. So she's not dying, she's just having a more stressful life.
She just feels like she is.
Well,
that's interesting. Yeah.
The death that you're talking about, Bill, I think is that you're no longer immortal.
Yeah, I certainly view it that way too. So the interpretation, of course, that Adam would have taken from that moment, on that day you will surely die. Like the moment you eat the fruit, boom, you die. That's probably not what God meant. On that day, like once you have eaten that fruit, it will surely happen that you will. I don't even know how well Adam could have even conceived of what death even was. If you consider, like, if all there is paradise in the Garden of Evil, would you have even any concept of death in the first place? I'm not sure that the instructions were properly understood, and I'm not sure it was ever really the goal for them to stay there and
Wouldn't have known what death was until after he ate from the tree of knowledge.
Right.
But I was wondering about the actually Adam's punishment about having to work by the sweat of his brow because even before this happened, he was supposed to till the garden, and he was in charge of the animals. He already was working. So that's
a good point.
What was his punishment?
Sweating. He didn't have to sweat.
Yeah, I think that's the real point, Ron, maybe, is that, and the story itself, I think, does make it relatively clear that it was easy to till and tend the Garden of Eden.
Sure.
It's hard work with weeds to be pulled and rocks to be broken up. And
you don't know when it's going to rain.
To farm outside of Eden.
Yeah. So we do have a lot more to get through. So I'm going to move on from here. Thank you for your contributions so far. We're going to keep going. So I want to talk for a bit about unnamed women. And the first one I actually want to talk about is Abraham's mother. There are some sources, not the Tanakh, who name her as Amatlai, which they also say was the name of Haman's mother. So that's sort of an interesting tidbit. I'm going to stop the share here and go to a couple of articles. So let me share those. One moment. All right. So I'm going to share the screen here. I have two different articles actually that have different perspectives that talk about Abraham's mother. So just to get things started, I'm just gonna read this out. You can follow along. So who was Abraham's mother? The name of Abraham's mother is not mentioned in the Bible. Not only does she remain nameless, but her very existence is only hinted at in the Torah. She does not appear during the story of Abraham's birth, but is mentioned only when Abraham explains to Abimelech, king of Gerar, that Sarah is his sister from his father's side, but not from his mother's side. The sages of the Talmud record that her name was Amatlai, the daughter of Carnabo, and that she became the wife of Terach, Abraham's father. We do not know how the sages knew her name, but when they recorded it, they also supplied the names of the mother of David, Samson, and Haman. Haman's mother is mentioned only because her name is also Amatlai, identical with the name of Abraham's mother. More interesting is the reason for reporting the names of the other three mothers. The sages said that the reason they provided these names was to make this information available to those who engage in debates with the minim or sectarians. This may have been a reference to the debates that the Talmudic sages had with the early Christians who were their contemporaries. It is also possible that naming the mother of these founders of the Jewish religion was meant to counter the Christian argument of the Immaculate Conception of the Nazarene. Who was Amatlai and what is known about her? Though ignored in the Torah, one Midrashic legend relates that Amatlai became pregnant with Abraham at the very time that Nimrod learned that a boy would be born soon, and this boy would successfully rise up against him. After consulting with his princes, he ordered the construction of a special compound where all pregnant women were commanded to remain until after they had given birth. He also ordered his midwives to kill all male infants that were born in the special compounds, but to give many presents to all newborn girls. In this way, no less than 70,000 boys were said to have been murdered. Does this story sound familiar? Right? When Amatlai was 3 months pregnant, Terach, her husband, noticed that she was very pale and that her body was growing bigger. She desperately wanted to avoid going to the special compound, so she told her husband that she was not feeling well. But Terach, a loyal subject of King Nimrod, reminded her that she must follow the king's command and report to the special compound if she was pregnant. Since he was still suspicious, he insisted on examining her, but a miracle occurred when his hands passed over her body. This seems a bit far-fetched. He did not feel anything because the embryo rose from Amatlai's womb until it lay beneath her breasts. Terach now permitted her to stay at home. Inexplicably, her body did not grow any bigger during the last 6 months of pregnancy. No one, not even her husband, became suspicious that she was pregnant. When the time came for giving birth, she disappeared from the city and wandered alone into the desert. There she found a cave where she gave birth to a son whom she names Abram. However, she was very sad because she was certain that sooner or later, Nimrod's agents would seize the boy and kill him. In desperation, she decided to abandon her baby in the cave and leave him in God's care. Miraculously, the angel Gabriel saved the baby boy. So I don't think we really need to read there's not much more, but that's that story. If I switch to, can you guys see the other article now? A different article? Yes? Okay. So this talks a little bit also, this goes a little bit further into detail about naming Abraham's mother. Is it not strange that the Torah would leave out the name of Abraham's mother? So the Talmud sees this missing information as an opportunity for heretics to question the validity of the Torah. Therefore, it fills in the missing information. Reb Hanan ben Rabbah further stated in the name of Rav, the name of the mother of Abraham was Amatlai, the daughter of Karnabo. The name of the mother of Haman was Amatlai, the daughter of Orapti, and your mnemonic may be unclean to unclean, clean to clean. I think that's sort of an explanation of why they're relating the two characters, because they're certainly vastly different. The mother of David was named Nisbeth, the daughter of Adael. The name of Samson was Lopanit, and his sister Nashyan. In what respect do these names matter? In respect of a reply to the heretics. Although we have very few records documenting challenges that were raised about Torah some 1,500 years ago, nevertheless, the Talmud here gives us a glimpse into what was considered a historical problem about Abraham that justified an answer. Why did the heretics ask, and from where did the rabbis get their answer? So here it says, for the mothers, we need to know the name of Abraham's mother. For regarding of all these women, the heretics ask us, what is the reason we don't know their names? And they ask about these more than others. For the reasons I explained above, we answer them that they were transmitted to us by the prophets through word of mouth. So they say, yes, of course we have these names preserved. Word of mouth. They're not in the Torah, but we know because the sages, the prophets, like we were told these names. So we do have some names provided for some of the unnamed characters. But I have to say that there is also some contention about this. Here we have the Book of Jubilees, compiled 700 years earlier than the Talmud, gives Abraham's mother the name of Edna. And Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer gives her name as Atudai. So there are a few different names that are being tossed out there. Even ignoring these alternative versions, the Talmud's suggestion alone merits a number of observations. Firstly, it is rather odd that Abraham's mother, circa 2000 BCE, living in Ur, a Sumerian and Akkadian city, would have the same name as Haman's mother living in Persia 500 CE. BCE. So 1500 years apart and in completely different areas. It is certainly a little bit suspicious that, I mean, not impossible, but suspicious that they would share the same name. I think it seems like it was more about a point that was being made rather than necessarily the name. But in a lot of circles, Amatlai is the most accepted name that's given for Abraham's mother. And it also might have come from the Greek name Amalthea, meaning tender goddess, and that was a goat that nursed the infant god Zeus with her milk. So there is an interesting sort of connection between those stories, because like being like abandoned in a cave, like bad, there were other things going on that made it unsafe for them, and being protected. Yeah, so the idea of the story with Nimrod and all of those, there was some elements to those stories which have echoed in other times, for other characters in the Bible. So I'm gonna get back to the PowerPoint presentation here.
Before you do,
yes,
I think it's kind of interesting that the reason they seem to have to be searching, at least in the sages of the Talmud, for names is to counter the early Christians who apparently are saying, we know Mary's name, so why don't you know these names?
Yeah.
It's sort of, I find it kind of interesting that the desire to find names is because of that pressure. Otherwise, apparently they're not thinking of it, or nobody else was.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about how important, like Abraham is the father to multiple nations, right? And the idea that, we've preserved all of his line, like the names of everybody, like after that point, why? And we know his father's name. Why wouldn't we know his mother's name? Why wouldn't we? Yeah.
Cantor, may I add
Please.
something about names?
Yes.
Just very quickly. It happens to be one of my pet peeves, which is the Immaculate Conception was not the Nazarene. The Immaculate Conception was Hannah conceiving Miriam, to use the Hebrew version of the name. So I missed who the author of that article was.
Oh, I can share. I'll share all the articles at the end in the chat.
Oh yes, so I was
so
just
you
about
can
to
see
say it's if it just seems disrespectful. I'm assuming as a Jew writing the article, but it's a little disrespectful not to get, if you're going to write about someone else's religion, at least get it right.
That's fair. I think it was given as like what the perception, it might have been the perception of like the rabbis of those times rather than someone today putting that in, but I would have to look at it again. But that's a fair point. So what kind of a person do we imagine Abraham's mother would have been, and what reasons could we see for omitting her name in the Torah, in the Tanakh? Anyone have any ideas about that?
Was she not a nice person, so they omitted her?
Well, I mean, granted, the story about her saving her unborn child from Nimrod, Nimrod's decree, that's not in there. That's not. That story is sort of from outside of the Tanakh, but that story does exist in other sort of circles.
Because Abraham's father was mentioned.
Yeah.
What was that?
Someone
saying something?
I was thinking that because she would have been an idol worshiper like his father was, that could be, but he was mentioned. So
but he was mentioned.
He was an idol worshiper, so that doesn't exactly fit.
Yeah, and not only is his father an idol worshiper and mentioned by name, but his father is accorded respect and grieved and given like a funeral when he dies on the way. So, but no mention. It's a little bit like, I don't know if we just sort of take for granted that like we're not going to hear as much about women when we read the Bible, right? But it's something that if you like look back at it, you're like, like why did I never question that? I never learned her name, never learned who she was or her story, right?
Because she wasn't important. The women weren't important.
It's also possible that she did not go with them on the trip, that she stayed behind.
Yeah, we just don't know. We don't know. Did she die already? Was she even still with Terach? We just don't know.
What's also fascinating, again, it's not in the Bible, but they do not like the fact that certain women were not married. Like Miriam, we never hear about a husband there.
We never
So
hear
they,
about it. Maybe that's
but
not important.
Bezalel, no, but they tried to pair her with Bezalel, and the rabbis were pairing people. They did not like that people were single. And yet it is interesting, and yet the contrast that they wouldn't have names for all the women.
Yeah.
Although most of the time, the women that are named in the process of actually doing something and doing something important.
Yes.
In other
Well,
words, they're not just
we'll
named as just being there usually.
we'll continue to get a little more into that also in like the remaining sessions, but yes. So what merits a name in the course of the Bible, right? Well, we're going to talk about Lot's wife. That's her. She has no name. Some sources, not the Tanakh, have named her as Edith. But in the Tanakh, she's not named. So I'm gonna actually also I'm gonna stop the share and show another article here, and I'll give someone else a chance to read. One moment here. Okay, and there are some stories also that are included with this. So you know something to be learned from this. Would someone like to read starting from Lot's wife?
I'll read.
Please.
Lot's wife, known to rabbis as Edith,
yeah.
Edith was rescued from the upheaval of Sodom. Jealous of others, however, she did not want to offer hospitality to guests. When she goes to her women neighbors for salt to give her husband's guest, she makes it known to the town that Lot is harboring guests. The townspeople storm Lot's house and remove his guest. Lot's wife sinned thus through salt, and for this she is turned into a pillar of salt. I thought that's because she turned around.
Well, there's more, so let's keep going.
All right. The Bible does not mention Lot's wife by name, but the rabbis refer to her as Edith. Is that how you pronounce it? Edith?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, keep going.
This woman's Sarian teaches of her life. Even though she was rescued from the upheaval of Sodom, she was stricken together with the other inhabitants of the city, from which the rabbis conclude that her actions as well were no different from those of the rest of Sodom's populace. Jealous of others, she offered no hospitality to guests. The angels did not initially want to be her guests, but rather those of her husband Lot, since he was more righteous. She even tried to bar their entry into the house. Lot's wife divided their house into two parts and told her husband, "If you want to receive them, do so in your part." Lot wanted the members of his household to participate in the meritorious act of hospitality, as had Abraham, and he asked his wife to bring them salt. She responded, "Do you even wish to learn this bad habit from Abraham?" She finally complied with her husband's request, but she acted cunningly in order to remove the guests from her house. She went to her women neighbors to borrow salt. They asked her, "Why do you need salt? Why didn't you prepare enough beforehand?" She answered, "I took enough for our own needs, but guests came to us, and it is for them that I need salt." In this manner, all people of Sodom knew that Lot was harboring guests. They stormed his house and demanded that he hand them over to the townspeople. Because she sinned through salt, Lot's wife was punished by being turned into a pillar of the same material.
So I want to point out for a second that you can see that these sources they're Talmudic. They're not from the Tanakh, so they came later. Now we have here there's further explanation. Okay, so this is a completely different explanation. Is based on her having 4 daughters, 2 married and 2 betrothed. The 2 married daughters and their husbands remained in the Dune city, as did her 2 future sons-in-law. And when Lot and his wife were saved from the destruction of the city, she took pity on her married daughters who had remained in Sodom and looked behind her. As soon as she saw the back of the Shekhinah, she was transformed into a pillar of salt. So that's a completely different story. So there are a few different interpretations as to why why she was turned into a pillar of salt. Um, I don't think we need to read this next one.
What's very interesting is, again, Chava was faulted for not following instructions, and here we have Lot's wife who didn't follow
Yeah. But she,
instructions.
again, I don't think she was really given the instructions. And honestly, so we'll see in this next article that Lot may not have fully followed the instructions either, but did not receive the same punishment. So can you see the next article? Lot's wife was never salt, and why that highlights the greatness of Abraham. You guys can all see this?
Yes, yes.
Okay, would someone else like to start reading? Please, yeah.
It is one of the best known biblical stories. As Lot and his family are fleeing Sodom, his wife, ignoring the instructions of the angels, looks back and is turned to salt. As it is a simple story found within a parasha with other narratives that demand far more attention, the Akedah, for example, it is easy enough to gloss over. Listen to what others tell you, or else seems to be its core message. But take one step back to assess the narrative, and cracks start to emerge. For starters, while Lot's wife transformation is typically understood as a punishment, it is difficult to identify her crime. True, she violates the angel's command, do not look behind you, but her punishment seems to be an extreme reaction, particularly when we notice that Lot, too, ignores the angels by tarrying in the city, yet faces no punishment. Indeed, just a few verses later, he receives a reward. A city is saved so it can become his future home. And even if we ignore this disparity between Lot's treatment and his wife's and accept that she deserves punishment while he does not, the punishment itself is uncharacteristic. Nowhere else in the Torah does God punish via transfiguration. God never threatens to turn an insolent people into stone. No enemy is ever miraculously defeated by being transformed into sheep. Lot's wife alone suffers this unique fate. The story.
So, yeah, we want to take a pause for a second? So pointing out, very important, by the way, I don't think any of us question the fact that Lot's wife was turned to a pillar of salt. Nowhere else in the whole Torah is transfiguration a punishment for something, right? And it points out Lot himself did also tarry a little bit in the city. So why is Lot's wife singled out here? And she's also still not named, by the way. She's just referred to as Lot's wife like multiple times. And so here's an example of a woman whose role comes up in the story, and she's still not named. Would someone else like to take over from the story demands reassessment, because it's a little bit longer of an article?
I'll go.
Please.
The story demands reassessment. Thus, Radak argues that Lot's wife is not singled out to be transformed into salt as a punishment per se, but instead is overrun by the destruction sweeping the city. Given that God is raining sulphurous fire upon the land, and Lot himself expresses his fear that he cannot outrun the storm, it makes sense that, should one member of Lot's party stop to look back one last time, it would slow that person down long enough to suffer the same fate as Sodom's other inhabitants. Radak's comments solve some of the problems. Lot's wife does not turn to salt as a supernatural punishment for ignoring a divine command, but as a repercussion of her lack of faith in the angel's words. Lot's wife's death is simply the consequence of her own slowing down. But a far more fascinating interpretation of the story is offered by Hiskuni. His comment not only changes the entire narrative, but also shifts its focus and leads to a deeply disturbing conclusion given the continuation of the story. Nonetheless, it is a comment from which we can learn plenty. You going?
Yeah.
After quoting Rashi's explanation of the episode, Hiskuni offers an additional understanding rooted in the ambiguity of verses 25 to 26, which state, he annihilated those cities and the entire plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation of the ground. Lot's wife looked back, Vatihi, a pillar of salt. Vatihi, pillar of salt. Given that Lot's wife is the most recent subject of the sentence, our instinct is to translate Vatihi as and she became. Yet Hiskuni applies it instead to the subject of the previous verse, the cities of the plain. Alternatively, Lot's wife looked back and the entire land had become a pillar of salt. As is found in Deuteronomy, all its soil devastated by sulfur and salt. Okay, keep going. His Goonie
So
basin.
we can pause for a second.
Okay.
So it let me see. There's more to this. This is a pretty long one. I want to also talk about what happens in the sort of in the wake of all of this. So I'll stop the share for a second. We all know what happens with Lot's family after they escape Sodom, right? Famous, so with his daughters, right? Because they think the whole world has ended. And now it's on them to repopulate the earth, and their father's the only man there, so they get him drunk and they sleep with him, and they have sons, right? And the sons that they have are Ammon and Moab, right? And we know the Ammonites and the Moabites are in frequent conflict with the Israelites many times throughout the Tanakh. So it's interesting that this is their origin story is from, Lot was a righteous man in the circumstance of what happened. Certainly it still does boil down to Abraham, because first of all, Abraham taught him about hospitality and righteousness, first of all. But second of all, Abraham was the one who argued with God in the first place, to spare any righteous people that God finds in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So there is that connection. I'm gonna let me scroll to there's another spot about this that actually says, if I can find it, there is another part of this article. Here it is. That Lot's wife actually is still alive and doesn't even become does not become a pillar of salt at all. So let me find the exact spot where it really describes this. Okay. So, okay. It is this section. It is section 3, but it's a little bit long. So, but I guess I could just sort of summarize what's happening here. One of the views of it is actually that she is actually still around, but we don't actually hear anything of her anymore. So if you take that view of things, and the article, I will share all the links to these so you can continue to look at these later. That really changes how we look at that story, because it's even more messed up that Lot's daughters did this when their mother was still there. So it's a very interesting story, and it's a very curious thing, why it is that she remains unnamed. I mean, if you take the view, one of those interpretations, which was that she was didn't behave well towards the angels, like her husband Lot did, then maybe you could understand. But it doesn't actually have that story in there. So can anyone think for any other reasons why she might have gone unnamed? What was that?
She's really not important. She's not
it's not important. Not important. Not important to name her. Okay.
And in some families in certain societies, particularly more tribal, sometimes women just don't get names. They're called first daughter or first wife. So it could be that she didn't get one, or if one doesn't think it's divinely inspired, that the human being who was divinely inspired didn't happen to know. But then there's also the idea, when you said before, the one type of, what word did you use? Transmogrification? I forget what word you used.
Transfiguration.
Transfiguration. Yeah. There's a difference between prescriptive and descriptive. So maybe it's just like one of those really unusual things, like a burning bush. There's only one burning bush. There's only one pillar to salt. And it's not necessarily a statement about a moral mistake, just you know, somebody out in a thunderstorm and gets struck by lightning because they're in the wrong place, the wrong time. Just, she looked back and this is what happened in nature.
But this story is also very familiar with the story, very similar to the story of Noah. And Noah doesn't, his wife also doesn't have a name.
You know, just like how
sons.
Yes. Just like how any but Noah's 3 sons are named, right? They have names.
They have names. But their tribes don't. Here the tribes, we have the sons become Moab and Ammon.
Well, I think it's also possible, and maybe this is reading too much of present time into something written quite a long time ago, but it reminds one of you know, very minor characters in movies. Even if somebody's credited, they're credited as you know, a second busboy or something like that. They don't actually have a name. But ironically, by her not having a name, I mean, the only people who are named who are initial residents or of Sodom and Amorah are those kings that are in the battle with Abraham when it's the 5 against the 4. Other than those kings, nobody in Sodom or Amorah gets a name. So it dehumanizes them in a sense. So when they get their punishment, it's this whole group of people who are all considered to be evil, and we see that from the way they behaved at Lot's door. But you don't have to try to get close to any of them because none of them have names. And Lot's wife is more one of them than he is.
I actually want to point out something interesting here, which is so first of all, along the lines of what we've just been talking about, is just like how any society has a creation story, all societies have destruction stories too, right? Cataclysms and
story.
Exactly. And some of them are also flood stories. They're just not Noah, but there are other flood stories too. But so I want to actually point out that the Torah does go to the trouble to name a lot of lineages of people who would have been wiped out, right? Noah and his family were the only ones that survived, but not Cain not Abel, because Abel was killed, right? But the descendants of Cain, all named and mentioned, and all would have been wiped out in that flood. And so it goes through full lineages of and names. I think it even names some women too, like some wives maybe, but certainly the men.
2 women curiously
certainly those men are named, and they don't have any significance in the story other than their names. They're named for lineages that are completely extinct. So I just wanted to point that out in a little bit of a contrast.
How they remember them is interesting. That they would remember all these names.
Yeah.
The only thing I've ever read that goes to explain that at all, and I don't know that it's necessarily satisfactory, but it is a potential explanation, is that back in the times of the first temple, there would have been stories that were familiar to people about these other named people, and that's why they're named, and we don't have that any longer.
Absolutely. The longer you go through history, I'm sure there are more and more things that are forgotten and left to the margins that we don't realize. It's absolutely true. Does anyone have any other comments about this?
I don't know what the answer is to this, but when we talk about the possibility of multiple authors, of course, I wonder if statistically some of the authors, just by their style or their intent, don't mention women's names, and the others, you know, where we do find the names mentioned, I wonder if it's different authors. I wonder if it breaks down almost that easily. I don't know what the answer is.
If you go through the documentary hypothesis, and anyone who's actually like really studied, there are up to someone actually like read through everything and sort of linguistically separated out different voices of what could be interpreted throughout the Tanakh, and actually said, and actually named, I think, 5 to 6 different voices. And actually one of them would have maybe even been not a separate writer, but someone who was just compiling and putting things together. And North and South was certainly a factor in that too, because we know that the kingdoms had spread out, and, you know, and the kingdom of Israel was destroyed earlier than the kingdom of Judea. And so when they came back, certainly they would have had different stories. So that does also factor into things. What are we left with? It's actually very interesting if anyone's interested in going into Bible studies like that. It is very fascinating. I'm going to move on. Other unnamed women, Pharaoh's daughter, right? She's just Pharaoh's daughter. And we know, and there are, of course, there have been multiple pharaohs, but we know that the Pharaoh's daughter that's being referred to here is the woman who took in and raised baby Moses, right? So someone had mentioned earlier the name Batya. That is a name
Yeah,
that
I
the sages
mentioned
have
it, but
given.
it's
A name that has been given to Pharaoh's daughter. And the name Batya literally means daughter of God. And so that name being given to Pharaoh's daughter means that even though she is not an Israelite woman, she is elevated to a high status. She's a daughter of God because she is the reason that, you know, our greatest prophet and leader like survived and led us out of slavery. Like it's a pretty fantastic thing that she, you know, and she obviously, she would have definitely known that this was a child who was supposed to have been put to death according to her, to the Pharaoh, right? But she hid him and protected him and raised him as her own. So that's a very special part of the story. So, you know, saying that she deserves the name Batya, that she's a daughter of God. Another unnamed person, Jephthah or Yiftach's daughter. Do you raise your hand if you know the story of Jephthah? You know the story? A lot of people, yeah. I'll show the picture. So the famous story, and by the way, there are many other societies. I would say I think it comes up in Greek and Roman stories too. The idea of Jephthah was a judge who ruled over the Israelites for a period of around 6 years. He went out on a very successful war mission, and he had prayed, you know, that pledged that he would, the first thing that greeted him when he got back home, he would sacrifice for God. And of course, what is the first thing that greeted him? It's his daughter, right? So Jephthah's daughter, it's very sad. She doesn't get a name, and she does get sacrificed. So it's like very sad story, and not maybe one that we all like to talk about very often. But she does not get a name either.
She's called Bat Yiftach.
Yes, the daughter of
Yiftach. Yeah.
And
yes.
he was an idiot because he could have undone his vow. He had all that time to undo his vow.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of that story, and the reason why you see it so many times is that, like, don't make promises that you can't keep. Like, you don't know what you're promising. Like, you shouldn't make a promise like that. Goes to show why we undo all our promises each year at Yom Kippur, right? But I wanted to point out those are a couple of instances of unnamed women in the Bible. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty more. I mean, if you think about those times, there would have been plenty of women who would have interacted and who could have been maybe part of it, but maybe those weren't the stories that ended up being told. Who's to say? But I do want to talk about treatment by the law. So in marriages, many men of the Bible had multiple wives at once. Look at David and Solomon, my goodness. Though it does not appear that any women did. So certainly society in those times was pretty different in that regard. Women are often recorded as respect in the Tanakh, though they are also treated as property in most regards. So it's important to keep those things in mind. Like divorce has existed in Judaism for longer than most any religion I can think of. So it does accord certain, protections to women with regards to that. But it's still not without its issues when it comes to marriage. And certainly when you look at the laws in the Torah about you know, when men would go on wars and when they could loot, and could they bring back concubines, and you know, the laws of those kinds of things. It's certainly not like today. And it's interesting to look at it from our own lens in today's society, to look at this, but knowing though that it certainly was a lot more advanced than any other society of that time too. So you got to take certain things with a grain of Lot's wife. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Zelophehad's daughters, and I also have an article or two to share about that before we wrap up. So Zelophehad's daughters, we have 5 daughters with names: Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirzah. So they all 5 of them they're not even just named once. They are named multiple times. All 5 names. It's a case of inheritance and land ownership for women. So I'm going to actually stop the slideshow for a second so I can share articles. Let me pull the article up. First article. Okay. So, and I think some people are for sure familiar with this one. So, but I'm gonna, here, let me share the screen. And would someone like to read? All right, so I'll yeah?
According to God's original decree, the promised land was to be apportioned according to the number of names of members of the second generation. Since only men were counted in the census, Zelophehad's 5 daughters would be left without an inheritance. When they appeal this regulation, God agrees to implement their proposal. The story of the 5 daughters of Zelophehad provides legitimation of a limited right of Israelite women to inherit land. It also places specific marriage restrictions upon any women who inherit under this right. The story celebrates women's boldness and at the same time offers comfort for men who have the misfortune, from the Bible's androcentric point of view, to have no sons.
You can keep going. Yeah.
So the story of the 5 daughters of Zelophehad provides a legitimation of a limited right of Israelite women to inherit land. It also places specific marriage restrictions upon any women who inherit under this right. The
You can skip to Zelophehad has 5 daughters.
Zelophehad has 5 daughters: Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirzah. He has no sons. Zelophehad is part of the generation of Israelites who departed from Egypt under Moshe's leadership and died during the 3 years in the wilderness. His 5 daughters belong to the new generation that would enter and possess the promised land. Their mother is never mentioned.
So that's another nameless person, but yeah, keep going.
Interestingly, Pharaoh is also not named, but
that
okay.
is true, but yeah, that's true. It's Pharaoh's position. I mean, we have certain pharaohs that are named.
We kind of have to figure out which pharaoh it might or might not be from putting together historical records, so to speak.
Yeah.
According to God's decree, the promised land is to be apportioned according to the number of names of members of the second generation counted in the census recorded in Numbers 26. Since only men were counted in the census, however, Zelophehad's daughters would be left without an inheritance. Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, and Tirzah come forward to appeal this regulation, stating their case in front of the sacred tent of meeting in the presence of Moshe, Eleazar, the priests, the leaders, and indeed the whole community. They argue that their father's name, lineage, should not be cut off from his clan just because he had no son, and that they should be permitted to inherit his land in order to avoid this potential injustice to their father's name and property. The story presumes a culture that recognizes a connection between landholding and preservation of a male name and a family lineage. Moshe consults God, and God announces the decision to Moshe. The proposal of the daughters of Zelophehad is to be implemented. The text then moves beyond the particular case to report God's further generalized regulation for order of inheritance. When there are no sons, daughters shall have first inherited rights, followed by other male relatives in a set sequence. This agreement is similar to the story of Achsah, who asks for and receives some of her family's land and water resources. Later on, the male relatives of the Manasseh clan, to which Zelophehad belonged, recognize what to them appears to be a large loophole in this ruling. Their appeal to Moshe is recorded in Numbers 36. The male relatives point out that when the daughters of Zelophehad get married, the land that they inherited will go with them to the clans of their husbands. Possibly the man might change clans in such a case was presumably beyond Israel's imagining. The relatives are concerned that the marriage of any of the daughters outside their own tribe will lead to diminution of the Manassite land holdings. Moshe announces that God does not intend any moving of land from tribe to tribe. As insurance against such movement, the daughters of Zelophehad and any other daughters who inherit land must marry within the clan of their father's tribe. The daughters do marry within their clan and eventually receive their inheritance.
So it is pretty much like, it's like a landmark case if you think about like the legal implications that like this was like unheard of in those times. And I'm going to actually switch to one more article here that has some similar points, but I'm going to go in. It talks about a few different things too. So let's see. It encapsulates the challenges that women faced and what they had to do in order to affirm their rights with dignity. Among these refers to the males listed in the census, hence we can conclude Zelophehad's daughters were not counted in the census and also were not to receive any land as inheritance. We might expect that women, heirs to Egyptian slavery and then put under law that frequently favors men, might react by keeping silent, by accepting as natural the rule decreed for them to follow. We might expect women in those days to stay close to their tents, remain out of sight, and not go far from their families. So how and why did Zelophehad's daughters write a new chapter in history? First, they dared to go out from their living place, from their social space, from the destiny imposed on them. The text states, the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. The names of the daughters were Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eliezer the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Let's imagine the scene. The Israelite camp is formed of tribes, each of whom has a determined place with a tabernacle in the middle. And in the center stand the main authority figures, all of them men, Moses, the priest Eliezer, and the chieftains. Imposing as this structure may have been, the 5 sisters decide to claim their rights. Together they go out of their tents without being called by anyone, to the place where only the high-ranking men congregate, to the place where the tablets from Sinai rest in the ark, to the place of holiness and authority, to a place where women did not have authority. These men must have been overwhelmed when they saw such a startling, unprecedented situation. So this really lays out like just how unexpected it is that this happened. Right? Not just that the ruling was made to protect their inheritance, but that they even spoke out at all, and what that would have entailed and what that would have looked like. But this is not all that the 5 sisters do. They not only come forth, but also they speak with determination. Our father died in the wilderness. He was not one of the faction, Korach's faction, which banded together against God, but died for his own sin, and he has left no sons. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen. Let's analyze what this text reflects about these women. First, note that these women know their law and history. They use the fact that their father was not involved in Korach's rebellion as evidence to support his and their claim to the land. They know that the continuity of family name depends on inheritance of the land, and they realize that the current law is not adequate, for it does not take into account the unusual circumstances of a man without sons. They possess the acumen to recognize this omission in God's law. But because they consider God's law to be just, or to aim to be just, they show no hesitation in pointing out the unfair nature of the present situation with complete confidence and supporting their claim with compelling arguments. So it really is a pretty special thing that happens, and they really had a lot of chutzpah to do something like this. But they recognized that this was upholding what they thought to be the true. The essence of the law, even though that law didn't exist yet. They knew it was, it was an omission, and they needed to point it out. How does Moses react? The following verse states, Moses brought their case before God. Moses discloses his inability to assess the claims of these sisters. He takes the case to God directly, who responds by unequivocally supporting the sisters' demand, and even by promulgating a new and permanent law to secure inheritance for any daughters in such circumstances. Thus, the sisters' claim leads to the law of inheritances being changed forever. As stated above, a key to the sisters' success is their full awareness of God's laws and the people's history and story. They insist on change by engaging Israelite traditions effectively, something the rabbinic sages recognized when they described the women. So the Talmud describes them as wise, astute interpreters, and pious. And so they were wise because they spoke in the precise moment when the decision was issued. Interpreters because they, in essence, said, if our father had a son, we would not have spoken because he would have the inheritance. And pious because they did not want to marry men who were not worthy, right? So you could say, like, why didn't they just wait until like they could marry and then they wouldn't have to worry about it, right? But they weren't in. That's not the state that they were in. So they needed to figure this out, like before they married, before any of that. Before like going on to the rest of it, I don't think we necessarily need to do. So it's the fact that that did cause a bit of a restriction on who it was they could marry. They had to marry within their tribe. I will say that, many years after the fact, eventually the tribes and the land inheritances and the settlement of the land had become so established that at a certain point it was sort of decreed that any of like the women who found themselves in that situation, who were just daughters and there were no sons to inherit, they sort of lifted that decree and they could marry whomever they wished, because after a certain point it didn't really have any bearing on the land. So when that happened, by the way, historically was Tu B'Av, which is the 15th of Av, which is often given as like a sort of like a Jewish Valentine's Day, like a celebration of love, that they could then choose freely. But it is interesting that that this is a pretty landmark case. I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint presentation here. So yeah, it's a case of inheritance. All 5 daughters then had to marry within their tribe. So that's like a consequence of it. But it is pretty special, and it's definitely a standout among really any contemporaneous society. That really kind of concludes. Actually, I'm gonna stop the PowerPoint for a second. Does anyone want to discuss a little bit more about Zelophehad's daughters?
May I
Please.
have a question and then a comment? The comment is, I guess it's a little bit of discussion. As someone who pays attention to names, when I was growing up, I never knew Jews who were using Noah for a daughter's name. And now it is so popular from the Zelophehad's daughters. I had an Aunt Tirzah, but that and Tirzah Firestone, I think, are the only Tirzahs that I know, but I can't even count how many Noahs. So it's just interesting to me that that's come back. That name is one. And the other is, I apologize if I missed it, but were you going to tell us your favorite character in the Bible?
No, I did. I did that earlier. I talked about Miriam.
Oh, sorry.
And I said sometimes that changes. Sometimes it's, Abraham or Moses or Rebecca. There's a few sort of characters I go back and forth between as having a favorite. Yeah. And actually,
I think
please.
it's interesting to note that they win the day in a sense for their cause by not selfishly saying, if you will, we don't care, we're not sons, just give us land. They say it's to perpetuate their father's name.
Yeah.
So they're in a sense, defending his position as opposed to trying to necessarily strike out their own. And they win the day that way. Maybe they do it that way in a paternalistic society, but they do it that way.
If you actually look at that, I mean, there are many other instances. If you look at Levirate marriage, too, like the idea of the continuity of the line, so like a Levirate marriage is what happens, if there's brothers and one's married and but then he dies, it's sort of the idea that the other brother, if he's unmarried, or maybe actually because sometimes they had multiple wives anyways, it wouldn't necessarily matter. They could still marry. So would marry the widow so that he could have children for his brother's sake that would continue his line, right? So It used to be,
Give Ruth.
yeah,
That's
yes.
the story of Ruth. So.
Yes, Ruth, yes, Levirate marriage does come into play there. Actually, the idea of actually the idea is even today, some people even still do this, where if that happens today, and like most people don't want to necessarily marry their brother's widow, so you know, but sometimes they have to go through a ritualistic Levirate divorce. Just so that they, you know, don't have to take up the obligation of doing that, even today. So that's interesting. So the idea of continuity of a line is certainly very important in Judaism in multiple instances, and even still carries through a little bit today. Any other comments about Zelophehad's daughters, or any of the other things that we talked about? Please.
Yeah. When they married, where would the land go to? Because wouldn't they?
That's why they had to marry within their clan, within their tribe. So they married like distant cousins, you know, who were still part of the same tribe. So that the land could still stay within the tribe and wouldn't have to be, think about the fact that when the land was divided, the tribes were in like different regions of land, like very different regions. So if you think about that logistically, it would have been a nightmare if they had all married men from completely different tribes. And then how would you put that? You wouldn't be able to put those inheritances and those lands together at all. So they did for a while until the land was like fully settled by all the tribes and everything. They did have to marry within their tribe.
But would have stayed in the family, because if then when they marry, they have sons, wouldn't the sons inherit the father's land rather than the mother's land?
So that is one of the things that gets brought up later, is that it does have repercussions for like what land do they inherit. I think that's one of the things that gets pointed out, that there was like a loophole in that law that they needed to close, and they needed to sort of figure out a little bit more. So I think it does need it. They did need to figure out exactly which inheritance is which, and who gets it, if there's inheritance from both parents. But think about, like, I mean, that certainly gives a framework for our society, even a few hundred years ago. If you think about like monarchies, or you know, like any like I guess landed gentry or whatever. Certainly, it was the common thing that the men would inherit. But sometimes there were circumstances where there were no sons, or no male heirs that survived. You know, had survived up to the age when it was time to inherit. And so there, in those circumstances, women did inherit. And then it did become an issue of, okay, so what inheritance is going to go to the kids to continue in this line? It is something that came into effect within the law.
I want to revisit real briefly my favorite character. I indicated was God, and we've lived with multiple names of God for a long time. And I don't know at what point in our thoughts, but we've assigned kind of binary, some of them are female, some of them are male names. Did that assignment take place, or was that understood early in the Torah? Is that a more Talmudic thing? And if it was early in the Torah, I think there's some argument to say that human women were not well represented, but clearly there was an understanding that at the highest level, at God's level, women and men had names that were rolled into God. And it's just an interesting thought. I don't know where to go with it, but I don't know at what time they were assigned.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I can specifically name when all of those names were assigned. I would really have to look into the the history of the names a little bit more. But I can tell you, in terms of two of God's most sacred names, which I'll, for the sake of learning, I will say, Shekhinah, the divine presence, the divine dwelling place, is a female entity, a female sort of version of God. It's a female form, even in Hebrew. But then also, even though it's not specifically a female form, it is very female related, which is El Shaddai. if you know Shaddai, Shaddayim, right, breasts in Hebrew. So like that is also a female component. And that's also given as one of God's like most sacred, like El Shaddai, like on high, like one of God's really most sacred names. Of course, Adonai itself, by the way, it isn't actually God's name. It's a placeholder, really, that we use for you know, Yud Hey Vav Hey, the Tetragrammaton. So when it comes to God's name, certainly, if you look at the Tanakh, which I mentioned earlier, that different names that are used at different parts of the story and different times could have indicated different writers for that reason. So, you know, we're all bound in the time and place that we exist, right? So the way we use language is going to vary from anyone from any other time and place. And we could be speaking the same language, even if it's, you know, I mean, look at Shakespeare, like 500 years apart, it could still be technically the same language, but it's going to look pretty different. So that is one explanation. I mean, when we look back at the creation story that we talked about at the beginning, you know, that's one area where gender sort of comes into it more. The part of the other thing too is that Hebrew is a very gendered language, and I would say, you know, many world languages are. In fact, there are multiple languages out there that actually have more than two genders for the sake of language. I think I don't know which language, but I know I can speak, at least German has three. But you know, I think there's some that even have more than that. So language does frame the way that we think. And certainly gender is something that we think about a lot, and the way that we see the world. So it certainly makes a certain amount of sense if that's how the world is seen, that's reflected in the language. I will say in Hebrew today, since today we certainly have maybe a broader view of gender than even 20, 30 years ago, that you know, Hebrew as well as English, most languages today are changing to keep up with those perspectives. And there are people actively working, coming up with alternatives to for people who are non-binary, for example, to come up with things that don't make people who are non-binary feel uncomfortable or unwelcome in a language. So that's a roundabout answer to your question, but I hope it touches on a lot of things.
A little. Really, what I was thinking was, you know, where we think there might have been an aversion to representation of females in our stories. It doesn't seem like it was necessarily that we were averting the whole idea of male and female, because our God was, you know, given to us that way. So there might have been other reasons for the differences.
I would say, if you go delving more into that aspect of your question, if you think about what it means for Judaism to be the first monotheistic religion, and how much of a departure that was from any other society that existed in those times, becoming a monotheistic religion then meant choosing God or goddess, right? Because those were the options, God or goddess. And of course, God, the male, masculine leaning component, then became the prevailing perspective and view of God. But if you look at the name, even at the first creation story, it was Elohim, which is a plural, but used as a singular. So that is sort of the
that's
start.
why the first creation was both male and female. Because we're in the image.
Well, that's why if you look, it's a very complicated thing, because you could say it's one God, and God is all genders, and God, you know, and God is so ineffable and impossible for us to understand. But God is all things. Look, if you look at the whole of the Tanakh and you lay out different personalities and ways that God behaves, contradicting every step of the way, right? We really don't understand God as well as we would like to. But certainly in that story, male and female, he created them So that's often given as a reason that God is both or all or none or all genders. Because if you look at that even story, male and female were created at the same time to reflect God's image. So that is one interpretation that many people take. I will say from my own personal perspective, and I don't try to force it on anyone, I like to play with just not using gender at all when I refer to God. I say God and God's self, and I just say God, and I don't use pronouns. But everyone has whatever feels comfortable to them.
I do the same thing, but I think of the word God as a pronoun in a sense. Because we have names, we don't want to say one of them out loud and we don't remember how, I guess is the approach to that. So, and that's why I go along with those whose responses say you don't have to hyphenate that word.
Oh yeah, it's sort of an extra level of protection. But yeah, God is certainly not God's name. It's just God's job description.
As a self-defined old person, Alta all that things, whatever. The one I really don't understand is, because to me, if someone is already using plural pronouns, which is a whole thing, then the obvious rite of passage at age 13 is a b'nai mitzvah. And
yeah,
I keep bumping into that people from that crowd who are calling it Brit mitzvah, which
there's
so many. But I just want to say it drives me nuts because it's not a Brit. It's not a covenant. You're already in.
You're already in the covenant, no matter.
You're already in the covenant. If you're already using
you could consider it
pronouns,
as a continuation of the covenant and like a certain. It is a.
But B'nai would be so natural. I mean, B'nai would be so natural because.
But some people view it because I mean, in Hebrew it really is a plural thing, and it's plural masculine, so it's a little bit different with Hebrew than it is with English. If you look at the English, they, them, technically, I guess plural, right? But it's been used as a non-specific singular since the time of Shakespeare. It's attested since the time of Shakespeare, so it's there's a precedent there of having it be non-gender specific singular.
I think,
but that's not really the case as much with Hebrew.
Yeah, exactly. Following up with Tybal's comment, I think if somebody does that with some kind of actually thoughtful intention, that's one thing. But my fear is that most people are doing that out of a lack of knowledge of Hebrew.
Right. But I mean, technically speaking, if you wanted to make it as an equivalent, that is an equivalent. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be what's comfortable to all or most people who are in those situations. So language is certainly, and I'm a linguist, it's a very nuanced, very complicated thing, and it affects how we see the world.
Honestly,
and how we see ourselves.
One of the reasons I went to thinking of the word God as a pronoun is it was easier for me to use one word than to be alternating back and forth between he and she and him and her, which just felt less comfortable than just picking a word that's generic and isn't either he or she, but both or all, and just using that.
Yeah, saying he or she can feel kind of limiting, and God is not really a limited entity. So that it's something to think about. I'm gonna share the screen again because I want to give you. Oh, actually, before I do that, I also want to say an aside. I didn't include this in here, but there also is a case of a woman who is named in the Bible, in the Torah, who is like almost a complete afterthought, and that is Abraham's second wife. Can anyone name her?
Keturah.
Keturah.
And there's
very
a
nice.
great kibbutz, Keturah.
All right, Keturah, and it's a complete postscript to the story after Sarah dies, that Abraham remarried and had more kids, right? Like completely something that we don't talk about. Just wanted to say that's also like on the opposite end of the spectrum to women who aren't named, women who is named and not paid attention to at all. Okay, so before we go, I'm just going to give you a sort of a taste of what's coming up for the next classes. So our upcoming topics are motherhood and family dynamics. That'll be the next session. Prophetesses will be the third class. And the last one will be power and sexuality. So these are the upcoming topics. Like I said at the beginning, each of these can stand alone. So if you either don't want to or can't attend one of them, you're not going to be missing anything if you attend another one. Anyone who missed today's isn't going to, and comes to the next ones, again, isn't going to be missing anything in particular. We're going to cover different things at each of these classes. Well, with that, I want to say thank you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for sticking with me, and hope to see you at the next classes.